And welcome back to our podcast on geopolitics, dear Rafat. We have been picking up last week and looking into the Iran-Israel-America war, and I think this topic is still relevant. And let's look into water and water security, desalination, like the attacks in Bahrain and also in other countries on the Gulf. That leads to the bigger question: water as a means in war. We have seen this at the border between China and India. You have the same thing with in regard to Pakistan and India. So what do you make of this war on this commodity of water?
I think it's a topic that not much is said about, or spoken about, I should say. But if you cast your mind back, let's say, a couple of decades, there were concerns being voiced as part of the whole, if you like, the commencement of the movement of the climate awareness, that water and water shortages, what does global warming mean for us? What does that mean in terms of the rate of population growth, how that was going to all fit together? There was certainly, I would have thought, far more being said and written about in the early part of this century than there is today. But clearly, water resources is an incredibly important subject, and not one that's discussed very often.
And you see it even without war. Karachi in Pakistan or Johannesburg in South Africa, they both, London, Mexico City, there's at least tension and fear that the water will not suffice over the next a couple of decades. When we look into this big geopolitical picture in regards to the war and everything that's going on at the time, we have been seeing the last couple of years emerging as some called an axis between North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran. And now at the height of this war, the beginning of this war, if you want to call it, you see that Russia and China are not supporting their friend Iran. What does this make of this talk of a new axis of authoritarian powers? Are they like toothless tigers?
No, far from it. I mean, I would have said if it's any, it's an access at some level of realism and a reality. Not so much Russia, but for China to become directly involved in this particular conflict only has one outcome, and that's the much talked about, much hyped, if you believe Jeffrey Sachs, for example, Third World War is coming. And I think the Chinese are far too pragmatic and have shown themselves to be very pragmatic to get suckered into this war. It's not their war. Yes, it has some implications that the Straits of Hormuz, the distribution of Iranian oil, is clearly a factor for China. China, we are told, has massive reserves of cheap oil that it's been buying, as we said last time, over the last few decades, so they can see this out for a while. But no, I think to describe certainly China as a toothless tiger would be to miss the whole point of where the Chinese, the way that they behaved, and the way will continue to bide their time. No one's picking on them. It isn't their war.
Sure, but they have been aligning themselves with the quest of the Kremlin in Ukraine, and that's with soldiers from North Korea, with drones from Iran, and with dual use from China. So there has been a formation. Of course, it's not a partnership like NATO, but
agreed. But there has been obviously it's like a proxy war to the extent that the Chinese would argue, well, who's supporting the other side, right? Initially, very strongly, very much in the leadership role was the United States, but now the other European nations are taking up some of that mantle. So none of them are fighting directly, but they're all fighting from behind the scenes. So I think there's a little, yet no one would take and say the United States is a toothless tiger with respect to what's going on there. So I think it's a question of, at some level you could argue both nations are testing each other out a little bit. And it far more, obviously, it's the US that is expending a great deal of military strength, military hardware, rockets, missiles, whatever else it might be, whereas the Chinese clearly are keeping their powder dry.
But when I understand you correctly, like last week we talked about this, saying oil might be at the heart of Donald Trump's reasoning and objectives for wars, hence Venezuela, hence Greenland. But now you also say, like, well, China has reserves, so it's actually, so is Trump's bargain equation not coming through because China will not be provoked or will not submit to anything that might be asked of China when Trump finally might be visiting?
No, I don't think that's the case. There is just no way that the Chinese government under Xi Jinping's leadership is going to come close to even having a twitch of its knee. It's never going to bend. But they didn't start this war. This is not it's not their war. They're not getting involved. And for the Chinese, and in fact, I think what this whole war has thrown, has the big issue it's raised, not just for China, but for so many other countries, is, do I want to have my economic and therefore my social well-being totally dependent on a part of the world that is as crazy as it is? It's got all sorts of militias. It's got all sorts of sects. It's got all sorts of religions. They can't even agree on which day. You might argue they can't agree on which day they're seeing the moon and therefore celebrating the end of Ramadan. How the hell are they ever going to agree on something more than that?
Yeah.
And therefore, do I want to be dependent on decisions made by those countries who are then totally at the mercy of external actors, or am I going to look at nuclear power? In fact, one of the subjects that's not been talked about much here is, you look at this and you're South Africa today. Jesus, why did I give up my nuclear stockpile, but not so much the nuclear ambitions? Well, first of all, the Ukraine-Russia war has taught us you never give up your nuclear weapons if you have them.
Yep.
No one's going to touch you, right? And that's very clear. And that's not me being cynical. It's a reality. The dynamic of the Ukraine-Russia war would almost certainly would never have happened. But if it had happened, it would have had a different outcome if Ukraine was still sitting with what was then the fourth largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Yeah. But sorry, just to say, Alex, is that in respect to energy, I don't need to be dependent on any external. So I'm just going to go back. Your home country of Germany, which gave up its on nuclear power, is now regretting that decision very much. As you know, at one level they're heavily dependent on Russian gas, at the other crude oil from the Gulf. Why do I need that? I just build nuclear reactors and have that. And especially now, the technology from 20 years ago when that decision was made, 20 odd years ago, to where they are today, that you can have much smaller nuclear reactors, easier to maintain, right? Easier to maintain, easier to put up. And the one thing we've learned is that from this war, if it's really brought home, is planning permission, the way that you take decisions which have a long-term fundamental national security impact. You don't wait for a planning decision to be made and wait for years before something is agreed, and because everybody has decided that, has given all their objections as to why the nuclear reactor shouldn't be in my backyard. No, we have a national need, and that takes priority.
I love it that we are on a little tangent, because the small modular reactors you mentioned, that's something that also Germany is now very sad of, like not being able to inquire.
Yeah.
China is massively expanding. Like so many countries are trying to get the permission for that, and you see like a new use of nuclear power in that context. But the nuclear arm race, that's actually interesting to mention, is because it's like in Japan, in South Korea, governments think about like getting their own nukes. Taiwan at some point last fall was also musing with the thought. You already have, China has tremendously increased its nuclear warheads, but it is still way less than Russia and America. But like that's also like a friend of Pakistan, and then India says like, oh wait, what, like Pakistan and China, they have more nukes now, so we also need more warheads. So you see a global arms race, actually a nuclear arms race happening out of the geopolitical situation at the moment. So clearly like there is still like the potential of an escalation of that sort. And in the Middle East, Israel is supposedly the only country having nuclear weapons.
Supposedly, but remember, again, an interesting fact that seems to be gotten lost is in September of 2025, I think it was, just after what happened with the US-Israeli operation against Iran, Saudi Arabia signed a defense pact with Pakistan. And Pakistan is has nuclear capability. Under what circumstances that might ever be called upon, we're not privy to. It's not really been discussed, but it clearly changes the dynamic significantly. Saudi Arabia does have access to nuclear weapons, those of Pakistan. And Saudi and Pakistan have very strong links going back many, many decades to the time, even during the 1960s, early 70s under King Faisal, when large parts of the Saudi military was effectively Pakistan trained and Pakistan supported. So, no, that dynamic has changed dramatically. But whilst you're talking about Pakistan, one of the things that you and I have discussed, of course, is what next. Last week we were talking about. Whilst the focus is on what's next in terms of the new administration, the new power, if you like, political power that emerges in Iran, at the same time, many people in the country of my birth, Pakistan, are saying, well, are we next? We are the biggest friend of China. We are the only one that's really nuclear armed. And if part of the game here is to put a squeeze on China, whether it's through energy initially, as we said, stopping China's access to large quantities of very cheap oil from Venezuela and from Iran, well, here's this country that may, and certainly has a lot of obligations to China, uses Chinese technology very significantly, weaponry. I mean, you only have to look back at last May, that's 2025's short-lived war, of the skirmish, if you like, whatever description you want to put on it, between Pakistan and India, where the Chinese technology was shown to be way, way, way ahead of where it was thought to be. This magnificent aircraft from France, the Rafale, frankly was left looking rather pathetic and weak. These are words of others, I think. So that advancement of that realization of what is the true extent of the capabilities of Chinese technology with regards to defense hardware, it was, I think, a big wake-up call for many, certainly in Washington, and for many, well, certainly in India, it had a big impact, and for many other countries who are looking at that and now who would never have previously even considered Chinese fighter planes. There's a long queue of countries making their way to China and looking for access to that technology.
Well, I have so far, Donald Trump has only said nice things about Pakistan. They did a new energy and trade deal last fall, the fall of 2025. So I wonder why, because he has made clear threats against Greenland and Cuba, but not yet to Pakistan. So I wonder, like, when you say, like, people tell you this, they fear they will be next. So what underlines their gut feeling?
I think there's a part of me would argue that that's just because Pakistanis are Pakistanis, and we believe in conspiracy theories all day long. And if isn't an India-Israeli nexus against us, it'll be somebody else tomorrow, right? But the fact is, if in the absence of real knowledge of what are the objectives, what is going on, I think it's easy to understand that everything is slowly but surely moving eastwards in terms of this plan. You can argue that the genius of capturing Venezuela is that we all know the statistic, it's the largest reserves of oil in the world. Yes, it will take a few years to get it back up to great levels of significant levels of production. But the largest refineries in the United States of America were all built on the south coast to refine Venezuelan crude. Now that is well and truly in the U.S. hands. What I think some of our listeners may not be aware of, but the pace at which the sanctions and the restrictions around the ability to sell and trade in Venezuelan crude from January the 3rd, the day that President Maduro was taken to the U.S., to where we are today, it's like heaven and earth, the difference. It's that rate, the pace of sanctions removal and the ease of doing trading has changed tremendously. So the U.S., there is a lot of method to this madness. And I think we should pause whilst there's a great deal of, look, we are I suspect many of our listeners, hopefully, may be children, as I said in the last episode, of a Kennedy-esque world and how it was made of the Peace Corps, and we all wanted to do great things, and globalization and the World Bank and the IMF and all these wonderful institutions, United Nations, were all being set up, and we wanted to, this is what the shiny world was going to look like in the future. I think one should give credit, at least at somewhere, that whether we like it or not, and intuitively and instinctively we don't like it because it's not what we grew up with, but the actions of the United States, in some respects, are not that dissimilar to the selfish actions that other nations have taken.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, no, like,
so I think one has to sort of be able to have the courage to admit that, look, if you were the U.S. today, if you were President Trump, if you were some of those closest people around him, you may not like what they're doing, but at least respect the fact that I understand where they're trying to go with that.
Well, I feel like what people that are not European tell me, like that's how America is now behaving itself, is something the countries of the global south, the so-called global south, are used to like for a century or not even longer. So Europe just now gets a treatment that other countries, Vietnam onwards, have been like enjoying, if I may say so, from the United States. So yeah, clearly there is a mindset. There's like still like geopolitics aside or apart from alliances that make other countries just feel like more the burden of this international order that we're in. But I feel like it deserves more props than we give it, this era. Like, I mean, obviously in Germany, where I'm from, the 90s were like cheap gas from Russia, protection from America, and the end of the Iron Curtain. But then still we have, since the end of the World War, 80-something years of peace and prosperity. That's what the natural order brought us. So I feel like if the other side is saying, well, we want to go back to imperialist 19th century policies, I'm not sure if they have so much to show for, which, last thought, is you see illustrated in popularity of countries. China and Russia are hugely popular in Africa just because they were not part of the 19th century conquest of Africa, so it feels to me.
But importantly, as you and I have discussed this before, though, Alex, they may not have been part of the colonization, but Russia in particular, or the Soviet Union, as it was then, was a very strong supporter of decolonization, the independence movements.
Yes.
And today, I remember just after the Ukraine war started, and talking to many friends in Africa, traveling, and I was just surprised how many of them took a pro-Russian view. And when you ask them the question, why? I mean, this is wrong, this could happen. No. When we needed help in the 1970s, under the guise of Marxism, if you like, who came to our assistance? The Soviets, the Russians did. And we won't forget that. And I think that is just a fundamental issue of, again, going back to some of the subjects we discussed last time, but people, if you come to their help, to their aid when they need it, will not forget. And this is something that's very important. And as I said, through Africa, when they see President Putin riding barebacked on a stallion, they cheer. This is, hey, good for him, right? Because this is, others may choose to laugh, but he's treated with respect because the country he represents was there for them when they needed that assistance.
And that also playing out in the region we talk about. It's like China was also a proponent and a friend of the Palestinians before they accepted Israeli statehood. So there has been, again, I'm sure that has also to do with the Marxist element and the decolonization element. You have Russia and China, interestingly today, saying we are the spearheader of the global south, but both have been, and especially more even than China, Russia had an empire also more recently. So I find it quite anachronistic that imperial powers like now can portray themselves as being like decolonizers, but I feel this worldview, this 19th, 20th century mindset is still pretty much prevalent even in the conflicts that we have today. Would you agree to that?
I think that's true. I think that there is a large element of truth in what you're saying there. But going back to your point earlier, what was possible by way of colonization, imperialism, back in the 18th, 19th century, it's just not going to be possible in the same kind of way that it was before. And first of all, everyone is much better informed. We all have in our palms of our hands a machine, a device that has more computing power than it took to land a man on the moon. Right? There isn't a single fact of world history that you can't get to understand. Okay, never mind what your version of the fact and the truth might be, but whichever version you choose to believe, you can access it within a few seconds. So as an individual, in terms of being informed, maybe even being able to make sense of what is going on in the Gulf today or around the world, these are all very important. Importantly, human beings are much, much better informed. And again, we may not like the decision that some individuals may make with the information that they're given, but at least they have a choice.
But I also feel like this is the trade system that we live in, a globalized world. It was designed so that wars are less and less possible. So literally the intertwinement is made so we cannot disentangle just overnight, and therefore also avoiding wars. But coming back to the Iran-Israel-America war, like what do you see like panning out? This is a highly contested region. Obviously, we don't have to go through all the history, what the British did and whatnot, but I think nobody is going to doubt that what we just discussed about is very vital and very present in the region. We talked last week about the meaning of Shia religion, like the different ethnicities in the region. So how do you expect all this tohu vabohu, as they say in the Bible, all this disorder to be like rectifying itself or just getting into order eventually? So how do you see all this panning out?
That's a good question.
The $100 million question.
Well, it could be $1 billion question.
Oh, yeah.
If you take make the right bets, particularly in terms of outcomes on financial markets in today. I would like to believe that there is going to be some common sense coming to the forefront here. I really do not believe that President Trump wants to be involved in any forever war, as the expression says. Which, if he pulls out, is there a vacuum? What happens then? And I think at the moment, this goes back to the same old question, Alex, which is what is next? Who's going? What power system can you leave there? It's clear that there's no Venezuela light type option here, at least none that we are aware of publicly. Who knows what kind of conversations are going on behind the scenes? But in the absence of that. That having the law enforcement, if you like, stay in the hands of those that were currently in power, keeping relative peace. If you don't have that vacuum is going to be filled by violence. Unfortunately, there is nothing there, and so whilst one can hope a great deal, and that I really would hope, and I do see that eventually will come to pass. How long it takes to get there, and do we see another Iraq-type situation, and Libya-type situation? How long will external actors sit outside? If the prize is oil, for example, and gas, how long before you sit aside and you say, well, maybe I should arm the Kurds, maybe I should arm the Baloch. Not only will they give the regime a good hiding, maybe they'll also be able to poke a few sticks in towards Pakistan, where, again, going back to one of the questions you asked earlier, Balochistan in Pakistan is the center of all natural resources in Pakistan, whether it's coal, gold, oil, and even now, as we're aware, very significant amounts of rare earths. You asked the question, I think, previously, why is the U.S. administration being so nice to Pakistan, where historically, or at least certainly President Trump from his first administration, made it clear that which side of the divide his interests lay in, and that was very much, obviously, towards Prime Minister Modi and India. The rare earths component is funny how that's changed the whole equation and that dynamic.
But that's also interesting. Also, they literally obliterated more or less like this relationship with India, like a heartbeat later. So you see, like there seems to be not like a long line, and as a plan. And like when you talk, let's say it's oil, then now we have the Strait of Hormuz, and I feel like Iran is totally. Doing what was anticipated, it's like clearly they said before we're gonna like block so every actor is like doing what you would have anticipated in a scenario. The only one who is not behaving like this is America, in my opinion. So you have literally, and this is again, doesn't matter where you stand on the conflict. It's just like it's staggering that you go and start a conflict that you do not know what the objective is, or we do not know about it, and then you have no plan to be pulling out where you have in a region where you already have a bad track record.
Agreed, but I think the caveat there is what we know about or don't know about, right? There's clearly some method of some plan afoot that we're not privy to, I guess. But I would hesitate to label the Trump-Modi relationship as being one that's over. Fundamentally, at some level, that is a relationship, if one wants to be clearly somewhat controversial, but perhaps sort of look at this cynically. India is a vast country, very powerful country, 1.5 billion people, 80% of whom are not Muslim. To the extent that Islam or Muslims are the bogeymen of certain aspects of American domestic foreign policy, right? That's not something that can be ignored dramatically. They're not Chinese, they're not Muslim. Therefore, they could be our friend, but they certainly won't be our enemy. And I think there's the United States will have a very strong and long-lasting relationship with India.
These countries are also interesting, and I could add a few, because India, Pakistan, but also certainly Turkey, when we talk about like the conflict in the Middle East and at the Gulf, but also Brazil, which are perceived, and Nigeria, Indonesia will be also on that list very soon, being like in the biggest economies of the world, having like economic power, which is also something that European powers might just be having to learn, that Nigeria and Indonesia are going to outperform or outpace them like by the middle of the century. So these middle powers, and let's look into our conflict, Turkey, which has a relationship with Israel, all the oil coming through Turkey into Israel, but then also Erdogan, since he's in power since a little later, since 2010, has been taking on the anti-Israel rhetoric. So I feel like, how do the middle powers, such as Turkey, actually already have the capacity to fill in a role in this multipolar world that they get assigned to just now?
They certainly have ambitions in that front. I think that's something that we can't ignore. Turkey, to a lesser extent, obviously, Qatar, but to some extent, maybe even the Egyptians. But Turkey still has ambitions beyond its borders. Turkey, as the current Turkish administration is, in terms of the inheritors of the Ottoman Empire, seats of learning. It's certainly a country to be watched. And if you like, in terms of Turkey, Iran, Pakistan as being three sort of centrally important, large population Muslim countries, never mind Indonesia, which is way out east with 250, 270 million people. This is a dynamic that's ongoing, and then it certainly has to be watched.
And Erdogan said more than one time, we are not confined to our borders today. You see back the Ottoman Empire. But like, just to rest with this a tiny moment, because I find it very interesting to see like what their power actually would be. Can a middle power like Turkey, or like, let's say, India in the case of Ukraine, Russia, war, can these middle powers be like decisive, or do they need like some more time to actually develop the skills or like the orientation in this new world order? To conclude our conversation today, like, what's your take on these middle powers?
They do, but I think if we're now living in a world where might is right, none of these countries in any form of coalition, and let's leave China out of this and let's leave Russia out of this, none of them are foolish enough to think that they're going to, let's say, intervene in the Iranian situation on behalf of some aspect of Iran against the United States and or Israel. It's just not going to happen. So I think that's the one tempering factor. But can they play a much bigger socioeconomic role? We've seen BRICS attempting to do that, but there is a middle powers coalition, as Mark Carney put it recently, that certainly could come to the fore and be in a world where the United Nations, as we've known it, no longer exists. They can certainly be an important bloc that works. I would say just one last thing.
Sorry,
that with some of those people who are looking at us, who are watching us on video, you and I are not wearing the same clothes as last week.
We have.
This is a different sweater. I have 6 of them in this color, as do you. So just
so funny. It's so cool. So thank you so much. The world order is in reshuffling, to say the best. Thanks for your insights. Thanks for your thoughts on this, and I look forward to our next episode very soon. Thank you, Rafat.
Alex, thank you very much. Thank you.